We've taken some steps in terms of, major steps in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We know that there's more to be done. We've agreed that we need to work with Quebec. We've been supportive of cap and trade processes for many years, and we are continuing to have that discussion with Quebec.
The cost of putting a price on carbon has come up. Nobody talks about the cost of not fighting climate change. This cost is passed to citizens too, whether it's healthcare, coastal erosion, spectacular weather events, as we now have to be used to. This is hugely expensive for our society.
I think the cost of fighting climate change is killing us faster than climate change, Rebecca.
Yeah, absolutely, because guess what? The cost of fighting climate change, as they put it, means that it's going to be costing us a huge amount of money on top of the expensive bills that we already pay. So what Kathleen Wynne is almost saying today is that she hasn't quite come out and said it, is that she's thinking about a carbon tax, because here's the challenge. If she's going to work closely with the Quebec government, then what that means is that if they're going to work together on setting a price for carbon, if they're going to work together on exchanging information around fighting climate change and carbon emissions in Quebec and Ontario, Quebec already has a carbon tax. The only way that she can work with Quebec is if she introduces one herself, because they're going to have to measure the same measurements when it comes to carbon.
Kevin Gaudette, the Premier of Ontario, is all about revenue tools, and so would hooking up with Quebec be sort of a smokescreen, a cover for just raising taxes?
Well, hooking up with Quebec won't be, because the cap and trade program they're talking about putting in place doesn't give so much cash to the government. They put in place measures that corporations have to buy and sell credits. She's likely to put in place on top of that another gas tax measure, I think. So not specifically the Quebec thing. And part of the problem with the Quebec announcement is that they're talking about a $10.79, I think it's $10.79 per ton of carbon. And it's going to also go up by 5% a year plus inflation. Yeah. And the Ontario government signed on to that initiative 7 years ago already, and they're just ready to pull the trigger.
All right, so, but if it's a trade between corporations, there's going to be no cost in here for consumers?
Not directly. It won't be a direct tax per se. Obviously, the cost of goods will go up, and bankers are going to get rich. It's just different than a gas tax.
But somebody has to pay some bill in order for somebody to get rich.
Oh, I'm mindful.
It depends. One thing I would say is that Quebec is introducing a carbon tax on gasoline starting on January 1st in 2015. This is something that Ontario could also follow suit on.
All right, so that's Ontario and Quebec, but now former cabinet minister in Ontario is moved to Nova Scotia, and Paige McPherson encouraging that province to adopt a carbon tax.
Yeah, well, when I look at this carbon tax issue here in Ontario, I think, okay, well, this isn't consistent with Kathleen Wynne's mandate. It's certainly not something she was elected on, but it is consistent with that Ontario Liberal government agenda. So now what we're seeing is all the way to Nova Scotia, former Ontario Liberal cabinet minister Laurel Broughton. You might remember her. She was in the news a lot when she was a cabinet minister and then finally sort of was pushed aside and then moved to Halifax, has written a report on how the Nova Scotia economy can get back on track. Now, there's a lot of work to be done in that province in terms of fixing the economy. There's some conditions in there or suggestions that are positive, I think, such as removing the top income tax bracket. However, which I'll mention, in Nova Scotia, if you're making in the top income tax bracket, you're in total paying about 50%, so it's huge. But on the carbon tax front, that's one of the suggestions, that carbon tax is a sort of fair way of taxing people because it's per use, and that's one of the suggestions for Nova Scotia's economy to get back on track. So we kind of see this Ontario agenda creeping east towards Nova Scotia.
Well, Kevin, it seems to me, I love the fact that Paige said that in Ontario, for instance, Kathleen Wynne didn't run on a carbon tax. It's not part of her mandate. Wouldn't put it past her to just do it.
No, well, exactly, because she talked a whole lot before the last election. She didn't talk about it during the election, but before the election, she talked about the revenue tools you're referring to. And Rebecca's great point about the new 2 cent a litre, 2.9 cent a litre tax, 1.9 cent a litre tax in Quebec. We're already 5 cents a litre in tax lower in Ontario. So to get on par with Quebec, that would be a 7 cent a litre gas tax hike to be on par with Quebec. And that would be $1.3 billion more into the pockets of this government, out of the pockets of taxpayers in Ontario.
Well, we're using up a great amount of our revenue in the first place, as you know all too well, Rebecca, because of the work you did on your documentary regarding wind power, just to pay for those turbines to turn around and not give us any useful benefit.
Yeah, you know, there are some estimates that the Green Energy Act, the basically flawed green energy plan introduced by the Ontario government, is going to end up costing Ontarians $15 billion in the end by all of the subsidies that are going to wind and solar turbines. And they are continuing to put wind turbines up at a very, very rapid speed, despite the fact that these things are very expensive and not producing the electricity that Ontarians need. And so this is part and parcel to the overall problem with the Ontario government. This is the highest spending government in Ontario's history. Don't be confused. This carbon tax that will inevitably be introduced in Ontario is about paying down the deficit in the debt. It is not about fighting climate change, because Ontario, as Kevin, you have mentioned before, Ontario represents a very, very, very small mark in terms of global climate change. If you really wanted to improve pollution and air pollution in Ontario, why don't you pave the unpaved roads, as Environment Canada has identified as the number one, by far, the number one issue that causes air pollution in Ontario.
I agree with Rebecca on that point, but I have to add that I think that the carbon tax whole trend right now, I think it's being viewed as sort of the new sin tax. So the same way that we see taxes on alcohol and cigarettes, it's sort of the new naughty thing that we're not supposed to use anymore, is this carbon tax. So yes, I agree it would be used as a revenue tool. That's code word for tax in Ontario. And of course, there's a problem with that, because Ontario has a spending problem, not a revenue problem. And it would be great if the government would recognize that. And governments really across the world, I think, need to recognize that from time to time. But we have to also take into account that they do have this sort of green energy agenda, and it is consistent with seeing pollution or carbon use as a sin. But it's not the same as alcohol and cigarettes, right? It's something that's a necessary use, that we have necessary use for. It's just a byproduct of necessities in our lives. And I think that a carbon tax is so unfair, because if you look at the direct pinch at the pumps, that price jump when we look at gas prices, it really disproportionately affects people in rural communities who have to use cars to get around. Whereas through cities, they're not paying the direct tax, although they actually are consuming more carbon or creating more carbon in their activities. So it's looked at in this sinful way, but the way that the tax structure would play out is really unfair for taxpayers.
Thanks very much to all three of you. I think, by the way, Paige is on the right track there. It's just that to call that which has enabled civilization, essentially, to progress a sin is just ridiculous.